Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the newest album from the Maine, You Are Okay. Now, I was looking forward to this album a fair bit. I was first introduced to the Maine with their 2015 studio album, American Candy, an album that I thought was really great, a fantastic pop rock record. Pretty much all of these songs from that album have great, catchy choruses to them. They're just really sticky. And I do return to that album rather frequently even to this day, even though I discovered it several years ago at this point. It's just one of those albums that still sticks with me over the years. I feel like it's going to be sticking with me for many more years to come. I wasn't as big a fan of the band's last studio album, 2017's Lovely Little Lonely. It was a darker, more mature effort from the band, which was something that I did appreciate and like to some extent. However, at the same time, I thought a lot of the songs from that album just weren't very interesting overall. Like, compared to American Candy, maybe like one or two tracks from Lovely Little Lonely have really stuck with me over the past couple of years ago since that project was released. However, despite that fact, the two lead singles from this project here, You Are Okay, were two tracks that I really liked. And as a result, I was hoping that this project here was going to be an improvement over Lovely Little Lonely. And after listening to this thing a good few times, I could fortunately say that it definitely is. And in many ways, I feel like this project is maybe to an extent what I hoped Lovely Little Lonely would have been, because I feel like on this project, the Maine, they keep the somewhat darker, more mature tone of that album, but also add in or re-add in the massive, catchy, explosive hooks that made American Candy so great. This project is one that, while I don't think it's quite as good as American Candy, there's a lot of fantastic moments and songs spread over this album's runtime. The album starts off pretty strongly with some of the biggest and most bombastic cuts on the entire project. The opening track, Slip the Noose, is one that just has a massive, grand chorus to it that I really enjoy. And then the track that follows this immediately after, My Best Habit, which is a track that I liked when I initially reviewed it in my track review segment. It's only grown on me since then as well. I love the chorus here on this track. Once again, I love how big it sounds, how massive it is, how catchy it is too. And then the track that follows this one, Numb Without You, another one of the singles I happen to really like from this thing, is one that also, despite the fact that I liked this initially, has continued to grow on me even more with time, as the strong parts of this track just feel even stronger now than they did when I initially heard this thing on its own. I feel like the chorus here on this track, once again, is just a fantastic, big, catchy chorus that I enjoy typically from this band, and I like the instrumental on this track a lot too, and I still think it's a really interesting mix of some of those more symphonic elements and the more typical Maine instrumentation of, your guitars, your drums, your bass, all that stuff. I think the instrumental to this track is really great, and one thing I do really like about this album is that this isn't the only track here on the album that has these more symphonic elements occasionally mixed in there. Some of the other tracks on the album, like Flowers on the Grave, for example, or even, I believe it was Heaven We're Already Here, also had some of these symphonic elements mixed in as well. And I like the fact that Numb Without You wasn't just the exception here on the album with that. I liked how they kind of made it not necessarily the norm here on the project, but it was something they dabbled into on multiple occasions here on this project that I found to be really enjoyable overall. I thought it made the album a bit more diverse and interesting. Speaking of the closing track to this album, Flowers on the Grave, I think it's a fantastic closer to the project and a fantastic song in general. This track is almost 10 minutes in length, but despite the fact that it's pretty lengthy, it's not a boring track by any means, and the band definitely makes it an entertaining and engaging listen. I like the fact that there's more emotional, slower segments to this track. I like the explosions of energy mixed in there as well to keep things interesting. As I said before, I think the instrumental to this track is very varied and interesting and exciting, especially with some of those symphonic elements mixed in on occasion. And I like the fact that the lyrics here on this track call back to some of the previous lyrics on the album too. It makes a very cohesive album overall. And I know the band did attempt something similar, I feel, on their last album with some of those instrumental interludes that kind of, when you put them together, made out the album's title. But I didn't really feel like it worked all that nicely there on that album. But here on this project, I feel like with these lyrics that are kind of repeated at different parts of the album, it makes for a cohesive experience that I think really works overall. I wouldn't say this is a concept album necessarily, but it's a lot more cohesive than a typical collections of tracks, I guess you could say. Overall, I think that this closer track is pretty great, despite the fact that it's a really lengthy song. It definitely justifies its runtime, and yeah, definitely one that's worth checking out here on this album. While there are a lot of elements to this album that I do enjoy and that I've already talked about a whole bunch at this point, there are some aspects to this album that I didn't find myself enjoying as much as I hoped I would. In fact, the one track on this thing that comes towards the end, Broken Parts, is easily my least favorite in the track listing, as it sees the band trying to kind of go for the rock band doing a more modern pop sound with this electro pop-ish drop mixed in there instead of a, actual explosive hook or something like that. And like a lot of bands out there that have tried to do this sound on previous projects and haven't really pulled it off, I don't think the Maine necessarily sticks the landing all that nicely here on this track either. I will say at the very least that this track is better than a lot of what those other bands have tried to do, because at the very least I could say I like some of the symphonic elements mixed into the instrumental here on this track. I think they're pretty good sounding and once again add to that interesting flavor that this album has overall. But pretty much every other aspect of this song just doesn't really do a whole ton for me. I'm not a really big fan of the very lazy sounding hook on this thing, or the lack of hook on this thing. The drop is just really limp overall. It's not very exciting or engaging. It's not really explosive either. It's just kind of there. The lyrics on this track are also at their most simplistic for the entire album. It's just not a super interesting track to me personally. And I'm not a big fan of the kind of fake out ending that it has going for it either. Mostly just because when the fake out ending comes, I do genuinely just want the track to be over at that point, because I do also feel like this track does last a little bit too long, to be honest. I wasn't a big fan of this track overall. I just thought it was kind of uninteresting, I guess. Easily my least favorite song in the track listing. The track Forevermore is another moment on the album that I don't necessarily dislike, but at the same time I don't really care for it all too much. I'm pretty indifferent towards it overall. It's essentially this album's slower acoustic track that's made to slow things down. Lots of pop rock and pop punk albums have tracks like this mixed into the album that are just put there to kind of slow things down, be a little bit more emotional and intimate. And I'm usually not a big fan of these tracks because most of the time they don't really sound that interesting, or they might feel a little forced. And this track, I wouldn't say it's necessarily forced, but it's just not super interesting overall. I just feel like I've heard tracks like this so many times before in the past that this one doesn't really do a whole ton for me. Like I said, I don't hate this track. I think it's decent overall at the very least. Like it's a pleasant listen for sure. It's not a painful song to listen to, but I just wish it was replaced with something a little bit more interesting, I guess. Overall, despite a couple of duds in the track listing, I feel like this album is a pretty solid listen from start to finish. I like how a lot of the songs on this thing are very bombastic and have really catchy hooks to them. I like the instrumentation on this album and how the band wasn't afraid to take some risks here and there. I like the closing track in particular for its, daring runtime overall, and the fact that the band was able to pull it off. This is overall just a really good, solid pop rock album overall, which is what I was hoping to get from the Maine here on this project. Like I said, I don't like this thing as much as American Candy, but I think it's definitely an improvement over the last album. And I know that their last album had a good amount of fans to it. I'm not trying to say that you're wrong or anything for liking that album or something. I just didn't care for it all too much, and I like this one a fair bit more. I like the fact that it keeps the mature, darker tone that that album was going for, but actually kind of pulls it off by also incorporating some of the catchiness of American Candy into it. Overall, I'm pretty satisfied with this album overall, and I liked it quite a bit. Would recommend this one to, pop rock fans, Maine fans for sure, and if you're just looking for some really fun, catchy music to listen to, this is definitely an album worth checking out. But yeah, with that said, that concludes my review here today. This is just my own personal opinion, so if you happen to disagree with me, either liking this album more than I did or disliking it more than I did, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own opinion in the comments section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, things like album reviews, track reviews, countdown lists, things of that sort. If you like that kind of content, make sure you subscribe. Thank you guys for watching once again, and stay golden.